The intel agencies of today are not the same. Now, does it mean that there have not been abuses or mistakes by the government? Yes, there have. What do we have in place for oversight, for accountability? There's also always going to be this tension between government doing things and then making mistakes. To me, that's a function of society. The thing I'm most concerned about is, does your system have accountability or things in place, like with a free press? If you have a society where, all right, government might exceed some of its bounds, but you also have pressure from the press, which is trying to discover those scandals. Military issue, are there civilian casualties? Does that happen? Yes, it happens. How is it addressed? What are the rules of engagement in place to prevent them? Like, those are the things that people, I think, should focus on, as opposed to, did the U.S. government do something wrong? Yeah, the U.S. government did something wrong and will continue to.
Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You have tuned into The Glenn Show. I am with Yaya Fanusie, a young man who I have come to know through my affiliation with the Woodson Center in Washington, D.C., a gathering of relatively conservative African Americans around the work of Bob Woodson, the great Bob Woodson. Yaya and I have been on a few calls where advisory council to Bob have put our heads together about this or that. He's impressed me as an interesting fellow, and I thought it'd be fun to talk with you, Yaya, here at The Glenn Show. I'm Glenn Loury. I'm a professor at Brown University. I'm a John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Every other week, I'm here with John McWhorter, my conversation partner. But on the off weeks, I talk with varied guests, and our guest this week is Yaya. Now,
Thank you.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, man, is because you know a lot more than I do about digital currency, about central bank digital currency, about crypto and this kind of stuff. Bitcoin, I don't understand it. I'm an economist who does not understand the modern financial world. I thought you might be able to break it down. You are also a former analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. And I don't know that many former CIA analysts. I'm very curious to hear about your experience to the extent that you're at liberty to share it. And you're younger than me by decades and interested in African American life and culture, and have an angle of vision about how to reach young African Americans that I think is worth exploring. So welcome to The Glenn Show, Yaya.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a long-time listener, watcher myself, and really respect and admire your work. So thank you.
We might start by mentioning the Jabbari Lincoln Files, a project of yours. Tell us about that, man.
The Jabbari Lincoln Files, great way to start. So the Jabbari Lincoln Files is a spy thriller audio podcast. It's a podcast, but it's a spy thriller that I wrote and produced myself, which is about a fictional account of a guy who is a CIA analyst. He happens to be African American. And he is an analyst who specializes in financial threats. And at one point, he comes to, he basically uncovers a sophisticated plot, and he's thrown into a global conspiracy. Interestingly, he's also, not only is he African American, he's also a practicing Muslim. So the Jabbari Lincoln Files is it's a sort of right now a 1-season audio podcast that tells his story. And it's not like an audio book. It's, I'd say, sort of a dramatic reading with sound design. There's sort of background music in the background. And it's sort of it's a pet project of mine that I released about a year ago.
Is it still in process? I mean, you have to follow episode to episode?
Yeah, so it's you can binge it. It's basically, we did season 1, finished season 1. It's about 9 full episodes, and it is a story. So you know, if you listen to it, you can find it, wherever you have podcasts. You start at episode 1, and you have to follow it sequentially. It goes from beginning to end. And season 1 ended last year, and I'm currently working on season 2.
What kind of following have you got?
I would say actually a very good one. I was very surprised. The thing is, I've been doing content and creative work since I was a teenager, basically. And when I was in college, I had my own radio show. I was really into hip hop. I was always into designing or producing music and producing and doing spoken word. The show has actually become a bit of a, I don't know, sort of gained a diverse following because it's a spy thriller, but it has all these sort of cultural elements, right? You got the main character who's Muslim, he's in the CIA. The character's from Detroit, and there's this dynamic with his family. And I've heard from a lot of people from different backgrounds, different political persuasions. It's not a political show at all. But yeah, a lot of people are asking me when is season 2 coming out.
All right, man. Congratulations on that.
Thank
Sounds
you.
interesting. I just might check it out myself.
I appreciate it.
You
And I should
are.
say, I should.
Yeah. Go
I don't
ahead.
mean to step on you, Glenn, but some people,
No.
because so it's a spy thriller, and I previously worked at the CIA, and so I often get the question: is it people listen to it and they're like, is this a true story? Is this who is this Jabbari Lincoln? Is it you? And I always tell people it is a fictional story with some very realistic elements. So you can take you can take that.
Well, that was going to be my question. Is there an autobiographical dimension to this? An African American, he loves hip hop. He's got a radical tinge to him. He's converted to Islam, and he's working at the CIA. Man,
wait, who is this guy? I mean,
talk about the spook who sat by the door.
Oh, now you're going back, Glenn. You're actually going back.
Well, I'm old, man. I'm old.
Well, here's a funny thing. So, yes, I worked. So I spent about 7 years at the CIA. Right? I was about to say at the agency is kind of the way we formers or people that refer to it. The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Very well-known book, Sam Greenlee from the 60s, then made into a movie. And I actually, so when I was in high school, growing up in the early 90s, high school for me, I was our BSU president or Black Student Union.
Where? Yeah. Where?
My high school in Southern California. So I'm from Southern California, and this was in high school, the San Fernando Valley specifically. And so this was, think about this time. This is the early 90s, late 80s to early 90s when I was there. And, the pulse of African American culture was hip hop at that time. And so anyone being a teenager then, we were really influenced by it. Groups like, you may remember, Public Enemy, Boogie Down Productions, Ice Cube, all these groups with it was interesting because you had in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, there was this sort of callback or, renaissance of the cultural elements from the 60s. So a lot of things that were produced in the 60s and Malcolm X as a sort of a symbol for sort of cultural and political symbol, all that, as you know, got sort of revived in the early 90s. And so I was in high school then. I was our BSU president. And I actually had a copy of the movie Spook Who Sat by the Door. And for those who don't know in the audience, right, it's a novel about an Black man from Chicago, African-American man who joins the CIA. And in the story, he is there for a while. Then he takes what he learns and he basically joins a radical, militant, almost Panther-like group. And he, supports an uprising in Chicago. I mean, it's from the 60s. So I had that movie. But I had that movie because again, in high school, many of us were influenced by a lot of that narrative and that rhetoric, those views. So it's kind of funny or maybe ironic that even though I had that movie back then, I had a certain mindset back then. That was the 90s. Lo and behold, 15 so years later, however long it was, I was myself working at the agency. I was hired as an analyst. I was actually hired as an economic analyst. So there's a whole lot in between there. How I went from young BSU president wearing Malcolm X. I used to have Malcolm X shirts, Africa medallion on my black hat, listening to Public Enemy, and through a journey of several years, I think my worldview sort of it matured, it changed my orientation to politics, culture, sort of spiritual, religious growth. All that stuff happened to where in the early 2000s, I found myself applying to the CIA. And it wasn't, as some people might think, since I mentioned Spook Who Sat by the Door, No, it was not with the intention to do what happened in Spook Who Sat by the Door. I did not, then raise a black revolutionary, a black nationalist army. So there was a long journey from point A to point B for me.
How'd you get interested in the CIA? Were
Well,
you recruited or?
Yeah, it happened. One thing led to another. I met a recruiter, but how I got there was, I went to graduate school for international affairs. I got a master's in international affairs dealing with finance. But I think, like maybe a lot of young people, I didn't have a lot of experience. So I was in grad school studying, but I don't think I really knew what I wanted to do. So I'm in this international affairs program, in this master's program, but I actually was interested in education, lo and behold. By the time I got through it, I was doing all this. I was doing tutoring. I'd done a lot of mentorship programs when I was in undergrad. And so when I graduated, it was really, I don't think I really knew exactly what I wanted to do. And so I found myself, I got a job working, this is the year 2000 to date myself. So I'm graduating. So this is pre 9/11. And that's probably good context because international affairs, people weren't thinking as much about national security as much as they would after 9/11. And I actually was working as a budget analyst in Washington, D.C. for D.C. Public Schools. Then I did a 3-year stint as a teacher, thought I wanted to go into education, administration, spent some time in D.C. teaching at a public charter school, teaching mathematics, actually. And I was like, this is not, I don't think I want to do this I don't think this is a diversion I'm going to continue. Education is not for me. So I started thinking about other things to get into. And at the time, I was looking at the Foreign Service. I was considering becoming a diplomat, maybe the economic cone, the economic track. And my wife actually is, or was doing her PhD at Howard University in DC. And we were in the DC area. And one day I was on Howard's campus, and at a lot of universities, the State Department has diplomats in residence. These are State Department employees, and they meet with students, and they have info sessions to help people, to think about the Foreign Service, et cetera. And so I was just networking because I was always on campus because my wife was there. And I was meeting with this diplomat who happened to be African American. And I was just getting advice on the testing process and how I could prepare, et cetera. And he basically saw my background, my econ background, some of the stuff I had done. And he said, have you ever considered working for the CIA? And and in that second, when he said that, my mind is flashing all the experience of me in high school, the guy who sat by the door, all this thing. And I thought for a second, and how I answered that question probably determined a lot of my, my life. I thought about it and I said, no, I never considered it, but I'm open. Tell me more. And he had just been visited by a recruiter who was on Howard's campus, who was, I think, handing out her business card and talking to students who might be interested. And he gave me her card. He said, why don't you call this woman, maybe talk to her. If not that, you maybe think of Treasury Department or Commerce, some other, don't just think about the State Department. And that was it. I simply called this recruiter, had a conversation with her, and she was with a certain part of the agency called the Directorate of Intelligence at the time. And that's the part of the CIA that has the analyst that does the analysis. And she talked to me about what the job was like. And I said, sounds intriguing. The way she described it, and these were her words. I remember she said, working in the DI, as they called it, the Directorate of Intelligence, it's like intellectually, it's like being in grad school, but you're working on things that are, dealing with, the stuff that you see on the front page of the news, stuff that's very important, but it's intellectually stimulating because you're dealing with current events. And Glenn, I don't know if I should back up on the CIA. A lot of people might have questions. I don't know in terms of how the CIA, what the CIA does. Do I need to? Does that matter?
Yeah. Why don't you give us a primer on? I mean, everybody knows the Central Intelligence Agency are a bunch of spies who are generating data and analyzing data, but probably not much more than that. So fill us in.
Yeah. So you think about it. Think the CIA. I break it down. It sort of has three distinct missions or components, right? There's the part a lot of people know about, which is just collecting intelligence. And that's like on a human basis, collecting human intelligence, right? Those are the folks, yeah, they're out and they're recruiting spies. They're getting information around the world. But then you have the Directorate of Intelligence, which is they are, collecting everything that's coming in, whether it's human intelligence, whether it's signals intelligence, stuff from NSA, all types of what we call intel, all sources, and they synthesize it, they analyze it, and they write the reports. They brief members of the U.S. government. They disseminate that intelligence. So that analysis, that's where I was. Of course, there's something else called covert action, which is a little bit more fine tuned. But the intel shop, that's where she was, the Directorate of Intelligence, and she basically said, hey, why don't you come in for an interview or apply, do the writing sample, all of that. And then they said, okay, yeah, come in and do the interview. And I went in and I was interviewed by a couple of different offices. I was selected for one that focused on Africa. So I was hired as an economic analyst on a team, on an analytic team dealing with the continent of Africa, because I had some Africa background. I had traveled a lot in Africa. Actually, my father is from West Africa originally, and I'd done some research in my undergrad years. So that was my first job, and that's how I got there.
Can you give me an idea? You say intellectually stimulating, without revealing any secret information, about what kinds of problems do analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency attempt to solve? What's the intellectual challenge? What's the skill that's being deployed? I mean, you have a background, I think you told me, as an undergraduate economics major. You were teaching math to high schools or whatever students. So, you're a quant. You know about central bank digital currency issues. I'm very interested in hearing you on that. But I'm just wondering, on a day-to-day basis, you come in, you go to your office or whatever it is, you turn on your machine and, data and analysis.
Yeah.
What's that like in a more granular way?
Yeah, well, you said it with the way you started out the day. I mean, actually, the first thing I'll say is the bread and butter for an analyst is writing and briefing. That's what the analytic tradecraft is about. I mean, you're analyzing, but in terms of your output, you are writing reports, short papers, maybe long papers. A long paper in CIA is not very long in like academia. A 10-page paper in the CIA is a long paper that you would spend a lot of time on because you have to be, your audience is senior policymakers, so folks in government. And so the CIA analysts aren't writing policy. What their job is, so day to day, you come into your office, just like you said, you log on, and you're reading reports or you're reading things that are coming in. You're reading the intel. And it could be, and obviously there's the classified stuff, but also open source, right? You're reading press, you're reading media reports, depending on your account. So if you're in Africa, if you're dealing with certain countries, if you're dealing with the Middle East, you may be looking, okay, what's going on with that political party? What are is there a certain threat aimed at the United States? Are there risks around corruption? Those sorts of themes. Anything that you think U.S. policymakers should be aware of, need to be aware of, you're tracking. So when you log in every day, you're saying, okay, what's new? What's happening here? If you're a counterterrorism analyst, which I actually should clarify, I was hired as an econ analyst, as we call it, but then I actually became a counterterrorism analyst within about 2 years. So actually, most of my work was on counterterrorism work, but it's the same thing. So if you're tracking, back in the day, it was mostly Al Qaeda. You're tracking Al Qaeda. You're reading what reports have come in about Al Qaeda plotting, and that was something I worked on quite a bit. And then you have to decide, let's say that first morning, is this significant enough that we need to tell the president about it, right? Because the president isn't getting all these reports, these raw intel reports. So you have to figure out, you talk to your team chief and you say, okay, hey, this just came in this morning. I think this might be significant. Then they decide, okay, boom, we need to write a presidential daily briefing article, a PDB. That's what the president and the cabinet members, close cabinet members would read. It's your job to write a concise, analytic, objective piece, which lays out not what the president or not what the government should do, but lays out the situation that you're observing in terms of threats or in terms of developments that you think the U.S. needs to be informed about. So you're writing that and you're briefing it. You have opportunities to brief. Actually, at one point, again, dating myself, but I briefed President Bush, George W. Bush, one time when I was working. So you may have
Wow.
opportunities. Yeah, you may have
in the room with him?
Yeah, in the room. I even have a picture. Maybe I can send that to you. So yeah, President Bush. This was in 2008. So I was actually assigned to a center called the National Counterterrorism Center. I know we're getting in the weeds here, so just stop me if I'm
Before I interrupt you, let me interrupt you just to say, send a picture if you have it.
okay. Yeah,
we'll use it to help to advertise this episode.
Yeah. Which I will say, I did have one of my friends from back in the day when, she said, "Yeah, I love you and I support you, but I still won't forgive you for taking that picture with George W. Bush." She some people were not happy, but when you're in that role, see, it's not about politics. It shouldn't be about politics. Basically, you're in there with, okay, what's going on in the world? What do I need to let people know about? So
were you there during the hunt for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously.
No, I came right after. And what's interesting is, so I actually applied during that time. I think I applied in 2003, and you go through the whole background check. I didn't start until early 2005.
I
So
see.
I guess that was still, the tail of it had been going on, but there were no weapons of mass destruction by then. And when I went through, I guess what I can say is that, that really impacted the agency at that time. At that time, that was such a big issue. I think all of us many of us who were hired at that time, learned about what went wrong, learned about, we learned about things like politicization and how you need to guard against it. We learned from even some of the people that were involved in that debacle or in that bad analysis. And so, we were taught that we had to be on guard for that. So it was something that impacted the new crop of analysts that had joined at the time.
You had some time on the ground in Afghanistan while working for the agency.
Yeah, I did briefly. That was something. So analysts, right? Analysts are not they're not the ones usually on the field or in the field overseas. Most analysts, right, are working in Washington, D.C. They're not overseas. But at the time, early 2000s, you had two war zones that the U.S. was involved in. So you had, a lot of times analysts going out into the field, going to Iraq, going to Afghanistan. So I was one of many. And this was, interestingly, it was, I went right like the week after the Obama inauguration, because I'll never forget. It was that cold, inauguration. And then I deployed the next day. So this was 2009. I spent 3 months. And I was in that role, just providing analysis for senior officials that were there on the ground.
Wow. A Black man, a Muslim convert.
Oh, yeah.
And on the ground in Afghanistan with the agency, producing analysis for the benefit of, I assume, commanding officers and military personnel.
Yeah, it was quite an experience.
Did you study Arabic?
I did not back then. When I became a counterterrorism analyst, it was actually, it wasn't because I had, background in Arabic or anything. In fact, I wasn't, I had not done much on the Middle East. Maybe, my extent was, years before, and in the 90s, I made the pilgrimage to the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. That was the extent of my Middle East experience. And I mentioned that too, because some people are like, "Did they know you were a Muslim?" And I say, it was all on, you had to put everywhere you traveled. So on my application, I had to put, I went to Mecca, et cetera, et cetera. So no, at the time, as a counterterrorism analyst, a lot of what you're doing, unless you are, someone who is a trained linguist, where you're actually looking at the actual, actual what people are actually saying in Arabic, you're reading things that are translated. Um, One of the things, though, that I can say about being a counterterrorism analyst at that time was, even though I didn't have Arabic, and of course since then I've I have I study, I'm sort of a student of the Quranic Arabic, right, more for religious purposes, for reading and understanding the Quran in its original language. Um, but one thing that I think I was able to do as a counterterrorism analyst was understanding the sort of the cultural context for references. So for example, just as hypothetically, right? Back in those days, right? We had all those, Al Qaeda would be releasing statements, have videos and statements from, Osama bin Laden or al Zawahiri, right? Whenever people are making statements, they're referencing things. They may reference something in Islamic history. They may reference something in Muslim scripture or an Islamic saying or tradition. And because I was just again, I was just an everyday Muslim, right? Well, not a scholar or anything like that, but as an everyday person practicing and who's, by then I'd been Muslim for several years, you kind of know, he's referencing this situation that most Muslims know about. Oh, he's trying to play on this as a way of propaganda or as a way to liken what he's doing to something that the Prophet did. You have cultural context, which helps you to understand, what are people trying to do? What are they, in supporting, at the time, right? If they're trying to rally people to support terrorism, how are they doing that? What are their references? And then the issue of radicalization also comes up. So to that extent, I was able to at least have that cultural understanding, and also just the understanding that, what they're spouting is a warping or is a certain lens or approach to the religion, approach to scripture, and knowing that in a real way. I mean, I kind of felt like a lot of my coworkers, most people, don't think. I would say a lot of people would be like, yeah, we realize all Muslims are not terrorists. I mean, that's kind of just, common knowledge. But you don't really have the reference point, right? Like, that maybe intellectually, but like, you're not really connected to the Muslim. You may not be connected to the broader Muslim community. You don't really know. You don't go to Friday prayers. You don't really know what's weird and what's not, and so, or what is warping the religion, or what's a different view. And so I think one thing that I had maybe was, hey, I live this religion. I'm here at the agency, but I'm still practicing my faith. I have a view that the United States is not an enemy of Islam. That even the war on terror, as many people would or did, try to frame it, is not a war on Islam. I mean, these were things that this is stuff I intellectually found. I mean, because I had to think about that before I joined the agency, or before I became a counterterrorism analyst. And I should probably say, like, why did I go to counterterrorism? I didn't intend to. I was, doing my job, looking looking at economic issues, and I had a couple people that influenced me. And actually, one was a Pakistani American woman who was a counterterrorism analyst. She was there before 9/11. She would tell me, like, "Oh, you should. We need people like you to focus on terrorism, and we need people like you." And I
People
was like,
like
well,
you, meaning Muslim believers?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's what she was saying. And because obviously there's there are people that may have just a what's the word, just don't have a balanced view because they're not that familiar with the culture or the religion. And so I thought about it a little bit, but I wasn't planning on doing it. But one event impacted me during my early days at the agency, and it was actually early on during my training, which was that bombing that happened in London, the subway bombing, 7/7 attacks. And that actually impacted me in a different way than 9/11. I wasn't in the government in 9/11, but here I am now in government. And that attack, for those who don't know, this was an attack, an Al Qaeda attack, where the bombers so they were suicide bombers. They were four relatively young Brits. And all of them, or most of the three of the four, were born in Britain. And actually, one of them, I think, was born in Jamaica. He was a convert. So this wasn't like 9/11. 9/11, you had the 19 hijackers, all Arabs, coming from overseas. No, this was attacked in London by Brits that were born there who happened to be Muslim. And so when so that struck me because this was different. It made me realize that, I kind of understand this profile in a way that is different from like the 9/11 guys, right? Who were Arabs, who were overseas, Saudis and Egyptians, et cetera, Moroccans. Um, and also the fact that actually I have a family member in London who I think, just escaped. I mean, I think he was in the underground and he came up not too long before that had happened. So at first I was thinking like, oh, my family in London, how are they doing, et cetera, et cetera. And that made me think a lot more about how I could, basically try to join the effort to prevent those types of attacks with my own background. How could I do that? And so that's one of the things that spurred me to focus on counterterrorism.
Now, my understanding is that the Al Qaeda types, the movement, the organization, recruited through various online interfaces, disaffected young Muslim men and women throughout the West and the United Kingdom and the United States and Europe. Did you ever encounter any such kinds of overtures in your own experience? And can you say anything about why someone sitting in London or in New York who is maybe a man or woman of color, maybe a follower of Islam, would
So,
find attractive such an appeal? I mean,
mm,
suicide bomber, you were born in the UK, you just blew yourself up in the fervor of your enthusiasm for a movement which maybe doesn't have that much to do with your own life. I mean, I'm speaking for the outside here, but I wonder if you can react to that.
yeah, I mean, maybe the first to respond to your first question is no. So I was never recruited by, I never crossed paths with an Al Qaeda recruiter or terrorist recruiter in my own life. So I could say that. Um, but on the question of the dynamic there, obviously it's multifaceted. I think what what I noticed is that religion, scripture, it's how it is presented, and I think especially in thinking about London and there are parallels in the U.S., but in Europe, the identity of many Muslims, there's a bit of a conflict there. So, as an American, and it's funny because in the early days, in the US, we talk a lot about how we weren't seeing that type of radicalization in the US to the level that we were seeing it in Europe, right? In the UK, in Germany, in other parts of Europe, because there's it's a different population. Islam in the United States. Well, the United States is different in terms of religious pluralism. So I think there are a lot of there are a lot of ways where you don't have that same tension compared to where you have the immigrant issue overseas, where immigrants there. I don't want to say it's all economics, right? But just a different type of immigrant compared to the immigrant that's here in the United States. Plus, you have an American, especially as an African American, you have an American Islam, which is a whole other issue, which has developed in the African American community. So you can be really an American and be Muslim, and it's not a conflict. I mean, some people do think it's one, but you do have communities that feel at home being American and Muslim in the United States, a sizable group. I think in Europe, you have a lot of other issues around um, assimilation and integration for one, but not and when you're young, right? Here's something I understand. I thought about from my own youth, right? That age range. I mean, you said it. It's like we see this now today. Just being a young person, that's an age when you're going through a lot of discovery, figuring out your own identity. I did it myself, before I was Muslim, because I wasn't when I was looking at Malcolm X, I wasn't thinking about the religious side of Malcolm X. It was more the political side. So I think that's very common in youth, and so so think about it, the 2000s, you had the war in Iraq, you had the war in Afghanistan. So you have these conflicts with the US involved, or the West involved in Muslim populations. And you have a jihadist movement. You had groups, Al Qaeda and others that were involved in fighting the US. You have the war. And so you almost have a recipe for those that are supporting the war on one side to tap into the the frustrations, right? To point to real wrongs that are happening, maybe whether it's military killing of civilians, the wars themselves, and you have people who are looking for their identity, maybe feeling, certain issues, and the fact that the jihadists themselves, the propagandists, they're using scripture. They're reading the same scripture that I'm reading, but with a different lens. They're framing the Islamic experience. They're framing certain verses. They're framing the Muhammad's life and his, you know, the things he was involved in a certain way that ties to the battles that they're trying to support. So if you don't have a very it can be very easy in a lot of ways. And this was what was happening in the 2000s. And I think I should have mentioned in terms of the UK bombers, yeah, one of them was Jamaican, but the other three, I believe, were Pakistani American who had visited him. They actually went to Pakistan and met with and got training. Right. This was really before it was all online stuff.
You said Pakistani Americans, but I think you meant
Brits.
Pakistani Brits.
Yes. Sorry about that. I believe
No
they were South Asian at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what about the charge that Islamophobia distorts and contaminates a lot of the thinking in the United States, even at high levels of political influence in engaging with the Muslim world? Do you buy that? And have you ever experienced, anything like that?
So, broadly, I'll say one thing about the whole Islamophobia thing, which I actually don't even use the term. I mean, unfortunate. So, yes, like
why not? I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, I never Islamophobia. Because
expand on that, please.
Oh my goodness, I detest the term because I guess part of it is so there's two. There's almost like the term itself and then how it's used. So both of them I have issues with the term itself because I kind of feel like everything is called Islamophobia. So a Muslim does a bad thing and somebody calls it out and that's Islamophobia. I mean, maybe a Muslim did a bad thing. I'm not going to call that Islamophobia. And also I think I have I'm really into words and terminology. I actually feel a lot of it, it's not because I'm Muslim. I actually I don't think people are afraid of Islam, at least not the Islam that I understand. I don't think there's a phobia of Islam. I think there's anti-Muslim sentiment. And that's also one thing, maybe it's my, CIA training is precision in words. What call things what they actually are. Islamophobia is like a catch-all term that means one thing and open to interpretation. Anti-Muslim sentiment, right? Sentiment against Muslims for a variety of things. Maybe how some of it is prejudice, maybe some of it is bigotry, some of it is reaction to what Muslims are doing or have done, an attack. I think, you sort of, even though you have, you do have organized efforts. You have people who are campaigning against what they see as the bad thing of Muslims or bad Islam, quote unquote. Yeah, that is a real thing. But I also think that on the other side, the use of Islamophobia, a lot of people have used it. It gets used to just dismiss the real things that are happening. It's like there's a certain defensiveness in Muslim communities, like there is in others, and there would be in other people in this situation, defensiveness where your group is being targeted, your group is being talked about. So there's a natural reaction to say, okay, boom, we got to defend ourselves against this critique, this criticism. So Islamophobia is this catch-all to sort of dismiss people criticizing maybe stuff that's happening in your community. So to me, Islamophobia is a bit of it's not that anti-Muslim sentiment doesn't exist, not that they're not bigots and prejudiced folks, but there's almost an Islamic, it became an identity politics sort of thing, which never resonated with me.
In a similar spirit, I read a piece of yours published in the Journal of Free Black Thought after October 7th, 2023, in which you, if I get it correctly, were at some pains to point out that Hamas is not the Hamas fighters are not freedom fighters. That's the wrong characterization of what's going on there. Is that a correct account of your point of view, and can you explain it?
Yes, and I have to preface it by saying when I wrote that, or just to say for now, right? It's not that, first of all, I've been out of the counterterrorism field for a while. I left government over a decade ago. So it's not that I'm following these, terrorism closely. I wouldn't call myself a current counterterrorism expert or terrorism expert, but
Okay.
I wrote that piece, Hamas are not Muslim freedom fighters, because I wrote it actually, like I started it like a week or so after the October 7th attacks. And it was sparked by an incident or something I saw at, there were protests, immediately, like that first weekend, there were protests, people could describe them differently, right? Some people would say anti-Israel protests, some would say pro-Palestinian, but this was like really when things were just getting started. But there was a protest in DC, and which a lot of people were active, right? I mean, that's a whole other issue that, again, I'm not an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but my observation was that I saw this protest. There were signs, and the signs read, just very clear. And this was just on video. I saw it, from people sharing it. And these big signs at the protest in front of the White House, I believe. And the sign said, "Resistance is not terrorism." I think that's what the quote was. And when I saw that, and it was a couple, resistance is not terrorism. So you put two and two together. Basically, what the sign is saying is that the attacks which have happened should not be considered terrorism because this is resistance. And the logical conclusion there is Hamas is a resistance fighter. These things, any of these efforts by these groups involved, they should not be critiqued. And in essence, they should be, we should be okay with them. I mean, that's the conclusion.
One way of putting it is Gaza is an open air prison, and what you saw on October 7th was a prison break.
Maybe people would say that. And
they have said it. I've heard them say it.
Yeah. And so I felt and feel that logic is, I think it's sloppy logic. I think it doesn't hold up. And I think it's actually dangerous to have that as your slogan. Why? Just looking at history. I mean, jihadist groups. I mean, you in your podcast in many settings, right? I know you've talked so much about the sort of Frantz Fanonian take on world events, where this dichotomy is one where it's basically, well, whatever, because of quote unquote colonialism, any action is justified. There's a whole sort of intellectual justification or ideological justification, and I disagree with that analysis. And I think a lot of people, you sort of just see it swirling, like it's such a very easy way of looking at the situation. And I was concerned that I love the communities that I'm a part of. I love the Muslim community. I love, I love my ummah. I love my community. And it concerns me when, because of very serious things going on, because of the emotional, the emotional resonance of certain things, because of the frustration and the anger, the sometimes justified anger, that we don't realize that we could actually, we being, let's say the Muslim community in this case, there's a bigger there are others out there, other ideologues that are terrorists or that really do support Hamas or do support this group, these jihadist groups, these sort of militant groups that are using you or using us, and that we should be aware. We have to be a little bit more critical. So that's why I wrote that piece, and it was really I just felt like I had to get it off my chest, because I didn't feel, as you know, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is supercharged. I don't even get into it. The piece is really what I think the piece was me saying was that we can't lose our moral compass when dealing with any situation. And I think even reading the piece closely, it's talking to everyone, right? And it talks about, like, even in terms of rules of engagement and how we need to think about, that Israel is going to be assessed on how it prosecutes the war against Hamas. And again, this is early. This is almost a year ago that I wrote this, and that those who feel that they have, and the oppressed, and that's the thing, because even as from a scripture-based perspective, the oppressed doesn't get a free check. I mean, again, religiously speaking, Islamically speaking, Quranically speaking, The oppressed don't have a blank check to do whatever because of oppression. That's not in the reading that's not in the scripture. Now, obviously, people can try to take it there, but I think a very honest reading would show that because so it was my aim to convey that to my fellow folks out there who were very upset about what was going on, and I got some blowback. A lot of people didn't like me saying that, but it is what it is.
I recall you say you were very much an admirer of Malcolm X. Malcolm getting into trouble with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad when he was still a part of the Nation of Islam for saying after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963, chickens come home to roost.
Only I said the chickens came home to roost.
Now, that's a sensibility. I mean, that's just one phrase, but that encapsulates a certain kind of alienation from the American project and identification, does it not, with what you refer to as the Fanonian way of looking at things, anti-colonial embrace of violence as an anecdote. And I'm not saying Malcolm was violent in respect to JFK, but he clearly was not siding with the American narrative in interpreting the events of that tragic November 22nd. How do you think, maybe this is a silly question, tell me if you think it is, Malcolm would be reacting as a very old, iconic figure in African-American freedom struggle to the identification of the struggle of African Americans with that of Palestinians, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's. I feel like I could only speculate, right? Because of how would he have evolved and progressed? I mean, maybe you can look at people who were part of that movement and came through that experience, right? There are people who've come through that and have had different views. I mean, there's some people who would argue the exact same way from, as if 2024 is essentially 1957 or 1963 or 65. There are people that do that. I mean,
and you think that's a mistake?
I do. Yeah, I do. I think there's, in our assessment of where the world, of how the world works. I mean, it's because the way we could think about this in America, we could think about this globally. We could look at certain events and say, well, this is just the same as Jim Crow, or this is just the same as the police brutality in the 60s. Now, Israel-Palestine, though, I'm not going to, this is where I go with my disclaimer, right? I'm not here to talk about, who's right, who's wrong, Israel-Palestine. That's not my lane. But broadly speaking, let me just talk about the whole idea of colonialism, which is, again, a little bit different than what we're talking about with Israel-Palestine.
Okay.
Because, I think about who I am. I'm the product. So my father is from West Africa. My father is originally from Sierra Leone. He came here in the 60s, met my mom, my mother, who's African American. And so he came in the end of colonialism at a time when, yes, you had anti-colonial struggle. You had the 50s, you had Algeria, you had, all the independence movements, et cetera. Yeah. So we look at the world today, we look at Africa, which I've spent a little bit of time in over the years. There's this tendency also, I hear it often, to say, well, the condition of Africa is based on it's only just colonialism 2.0. It's based on because you have the relationship of Europe and they'll put even America, even though America is not a colonial power to Africa, but they'll say the exact same thing. And I think that lens, okay, I get that logic, but it doesn't account for certain accountability and agency. Because when you look at countries today, and this is where, here's the thing, this is where I'll bring in the CIA, because one thing you get from working in the intel world and dealing with foreign policy, and this really impacted me, because when I actually saw it, you really kind of see how foreign policy works. And some people, I don't know, people may think I'm trying to dismiss or downplay America's role. I'm just trying to be honest. So when you see how the sausage is made of foreign policy, America's huge influence, actually, I was thinking recently, this is how I would say it. America's massive influence and influence over countries in the world, as big as it is, I would describe it as being consensual. And what I mean is that, people will just say it's almost like America's omniscient or not omniscient, omnipotent, right? And the whole world, all these countries are doing America's beck and call. Okay, that's a certain reading. But one thing you get from working in an environment where you see the give and the take, you see the tension, you see America trying to push its interests, getting pushed back on, you actually see there's a lot more play there. And you also see the agency of leaders, and you see situations where, okay, yeah, maybe they do stand up. You see situations where, they change directions or they don't change directions. And you kind of actually get a more realistic sense that America is not all powerful as we think it is on the outside. That's a very good, it's a narrative that maybe it kind of helps America in many ways. But in just my experience, you miss a lot there. So for African countries, you miss the relevance of corruption. I mean, I'll say a lot of even African Americans, like, because we think about the colonial experience, it's like, oh, country X in Africa, is not doing what it should be doing economically. The things are terrible because, America and Europe has it, they've got their boots on the necks of the country. That's not my reading. My reading is, yes, there are definitely interests. There are definitely European interests, American interests. There are people taking advantage. Now you got to talk about China, right? But then you also have a multi-decade legacy of career despotism or career leadership of countries. And it's not just corruption, poor management. I mean, once you're in these countries and you experience them, you see it. It's not just about the West is manipulating them. I'm just trying to be accurate. That's how I see it.
Okay. No. I mean, no problem. I think that's a mature and balanced take, and I love the point about agency. And I chafe. Of course, it's only an analogy, but I chafe based on my own experience here in the United States, talking about racial issues at the endowment of the white man with the all-powerful ability to control everything that happens in our lives, as if we don't have any responsibility for, how our institutions function and what we do with our time and how we raise our children and what values we embrace and things of this kind. So I hear you. I think it's very interesting. Patrice Lumumba.
Oh, no.
Is he not a victim of intelligence agencies such as the one that you once worked for, who couldn't stand that a charismatic communist leader would emerge in a developing country and maybe appropriate its own resources and kick the Brits and the Americans and the Belgians out?
Yeah, I mean, and that's one thing about when I decided to go there, right? Because I had to be honest. I was like, because again, I wasn't looking, I had never thought I would go in that route. I was never thinking about it. But when it was presented, I started to think, okay, let me research this stuff. Let me research what happened in the 50s and 60s. But you know what? I find this both with the sort of colonial topic and the African American experience. People forget the 70s. So what happened in the 50s and 60s, right? We know Jim Crow, we know all the stuff that happened. What happened in the 70s? So I actually think, so a lot of people don't know. So in the 70s, what did America do? 1975, I was just reading somewhere where there was a quote saying 1975 in the US was the year of intelligence, because you had the Church Committee in Congress, which looked at the abuses of the American intel agency, of the CIA, of COINTELPRO, right? That's what most people think about when you talk about intel, at least in the Black community. It's COINTELPRO, and that's, I knew about COINTELPRO again from high school. Everybody knew about COINTELPRO, what it did with the Panthers and Martin Luther King. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to ask you to expand a little bit on what COINTELPRO is for those many in my audience who will not know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and this is going to be very loose, right? Because it's something I haven't looked at But what you learned was that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover did have a program, an intelligence program, to go after groups that it deemed in the United States, even. So I mean, COINTELPRO involved the FBI, but also there were abuses by the CIA. basically weaponizing the intel apparatus to go after civil rights groups, to go after domestic groups in the United States. So bringing these tools and authorities against people, let's say, protesting the Vietnam War or civil rights groups. So that COINTELPRO was something that happened, throughout the 60s and early 70s. And in 1975, there was a committee or commission on the Hill to look at these abuses, to write about them, to have hearings, et cetera, to release them. And there was reform. There was reform of the intel agencies, of the CIA, more oversight, because there wasn't proper oversight in the 60s and the early 70s. So you had this shift where basically you started to see, okay, actually the CIA was reined in a bit. There were more rules for the FBI. But you can't overlook that your father's CIA, which I should have mentioned this, is that when the guy at Howard, asked me about, do I want to work for the CIA? His words were, he said, because he saw me sort of think about it, and he said, I know a lot of brothers that work at the CIA. It's not your father's CIA anymore. Those were his words. I'll never forget. And, because what he was saying, it's not the exact same. A lot of African Americans working there, and was the U.S. government doing things that were maybe that were shady or that we looked down upon, especially. And then there's the broader context of this was the Cold War. So I'm not even passing judgment where I'm going to just say, oh, this was, oh my goodness, how all these moral outrage, all these moral violations that the government had. Okay. There was a big context of the Cold War. This was driving foreign policy, and this is why you had this, a lot of these things happening. Again, not justifying, but just framing them. So a lot of that was reined in. So the intel agencies of today are not the same. Now, does it mean that there have not been abuses or mistakes by the government? Absolutely, yes, there have. But what do we have in place for oversight, for accountability? There's also always going to be this tension, right? This tension between government doing things and then making mistakes or transgressing. To me, that's a function of a society, right? Unfortunately, that's sort of, whether it's human nature or just being humans. The thing I'm most concerned about is, does your system have accountability or things in place to rein those in, for discovery of them, like with a free press, which should help? If you have a society where, all right, government may, might exceed some of its bounds, but you also have pressure from the press, which is trying to discover those scandals and is trying to, so you have a healthy arrangement. That's what, and military issues, are there civilian casualties? Does that happen? Yes, it happens. How is it addressed? What are the rules of engagement in place to prevent them? Like, those are the things that people, I think, should focus on, as opposed to, did the U.S. government do something wrong? Yeah, the U.S. government did something wrong and will continue to.
I want to have you back and talk about crypto, because we're at the end of the hour, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking. A lot of people are looking forward to Donald Trump, who just won this election, releasing classified files bearing on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which a lot of people think contain information implicating the Central Intelligence Agency in the murder of an American president. Now, one way reacting to that is hysterical, beyond belief, couldn't happen in America. And another way of reacting is, I told you so. I'm wondering how you react to even the possibility. I'm not expecting you to reveal any information, but I'm just wondering whether the narrative sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory to you, or whether or not it's something that is within the realm of even 0.05 type probability of being true.
Yeah, I don't have much to say on it.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, but to put me on the spot. No. No. I think truth is good. I'm not. Actually, I don't want the audience to think I'm. Obviously, I'm never going to share anything that I can't share. But I'm also going to say, like, I don't have anything to share on this. Anyway. But I do think it's going to be. We're in the age of conspiracy theories. There are a lot of reasons why conspiracy theories are very prominent nowadays. But I think truth is good. Truth is good, and I think the American public can deal with whatever our past has been. That's what I think.
All right. Yaya Fanusie, former CIA analyst, creator of the Jabbari Lincoln Files, a podcast which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. And the first of what I hope will be many visits to the Glenn Show. Yaya, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Glenn. And I forgot to mention one thing, if I can, super quickly,
Sure.
because I said the podcast is, I'm working on season 2. I have another podcast called Designated, where I interview people in the world of money laundering and financial crime. And Designated with Yaya Fanusie is another podcast that people can find me at.
That's worth looking into, and I expect that we can be talking about that the next time you visit the Glenn Show, Yaya.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.